The morning Landon Vale dismissed Nadira Baines from the production floor of Aethon Energy Systems. He did it in front of 43 people and did not lower his voice once. He stood between the stainless fabrication tables and the row of calibrated hydraulic presses. She had designed herself a decade earlier, his blazer pressed sharp enough to look almost absurd against the background of chemical hoods and lithium powder residue. And he informed her, and everyone within earshot, that her role in this company's future had reached its natural end. 12 engineers from the finest research universities in the world had been contracted to modernize the electrode production process, he said. They would bring Aethon into the 21st century with the kind of rigor and reproducibility that intuition alone could never provide. Nadira Baines did not argue with him. She peeled off her thin latex gloves, the same kind she had worn every single day for 12 years, folded them neatly, and set them on the corner of the nearest press housing. She gathered the worn leather notebook she kept at her station, the one thick with 12 years of handwritten observations in margins. So small they required a magnifying glass to read, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the exit doors at the far end of the production bay, at the same steady pace she used every morning. No one stopped her. No one said a word. A few technicians watched from their stations, their hands still, but their eyes following her all the way to the doors. One young quality technician, barely 2 years into the job, looked away before she reached them, as though watching her leave felt like witnessing something he wasn't supposed to see. She pushed through the heavy doors and was gone. 6 hours later, the first batch of electrode stacks produced entirely under the new system began failing alignment under load testing. Then the second batch, then a third. The cells were delaminating at the electrode boundary, a fault so fine it didn't appear on any sensor readout until the cell was under full charge pressure, at which point it produced not a clean discharge but a violent internal collapse that destroyed the entire assembly in under 4 seconds. By the end of the first week, the failure rate had reached 61%. Nobody laughed. Nobody shouted. The 12 engineers, still wearing the pressed company issue shirts Landon had provided on their first day, hunched over laptops in the testing bay and went very, very quiet. Aethon Energy Systems had been built on a theory that most people in the battery industry had dismissed as wishful thinking when Nadira Baines first articulated it 12 years earlier in a converted garage in South Baltimore. The theory was simple: that the energy density ceiling in conventional lithium batteries wasn't a chemistry problem, but a manufacturing pressure problem, and that solving it didn't require new materials. It required a fundamentally different understanding of how electrode layers responded to the specific force applied during stacking. She had developed this theory not inside a university laboratory, but in the back of a battery refurbishment shop, where she'd worked nights after her second shift at a distribution center, reading borrowed textbooks by the light of a clip-on desk lamp, testing ideas on salvage cells during the slow hours after midnight, when the shop's owner went home and left her the keys. Her formal education had ended with a high school diploma from a Baltimore public school. She was a black woman from a neighborhood where the library's science section was the most reliable source of heat in January, and she had used it accordingly. What she had instead of a degree was 12 years of accumulated sensory knowledge, the kind that could not be downloaded or modeled or replicated by any software yet written. She knew exactly how an electrode stack felt under calibrated fingertips when the laminar compression was right, and exactly how it felt when it was off by the width of a human hair. The stacks that came out of her hands had an energy density 40% higher than anything else available in the market. This was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the result of a calibration process she had developed slowly over years, adjusting the hydraulic pressure not in the newtons that the machine's digital panel measured, but in a personal unit she had written in the margins of her early notebooks: paper thickness. The difference between a perfect cell and a failed one was often no more than 3 sheets of standard copy paper worth of additional press force, applied for exactly the right duration, at exactly the right stage of the lamination cycle. A judgment that no sensor in existence could make because the variable the sensor measured was not the variable that mattered. That process had built Aethon from a garage operation into a company worth just over $1 billion. Nadira's founding equity, quietly retained through every funding round, had made her wealthy beyond anything she had grown up imagining. She had not told Landon this when he joined. She had not seen any reason to. She came to work in the same faded company sweatshirts she'd bought in bulk during Aethon's third year, kept her hands in the process the same way she always had, and held the modest title of Chief Materials Scientist without apparent interest in upgrading it. Landon Vale had looked at that title, at the absence of advanced degrees in her file, at the handwritten notebooks rather than published research papers, and had arrived at a conclusion in under 5 minutes that 12 years of 94% yield rates had done nothing to dislodge. He trusted the paper in front of him. The paper told him he was looking at a technician. He was 31 years old. He had a Harvard MBA and a Stanford engineering degree. He had restructured 2 medical device companies and believed, with the particular certainty of someone who had never yet been wrong in a way that cost him something irreplaceable, that process standardization and analytical rigor could optimize any system a human hand had previously operated by feel. He had not walked the production floor himself more than twice in his first 4 months. He did not think that was a problem. The numbers looked right from the glass office upstairs, and the numbers were what he understood. The 12 engineers were exceptional people by every measurable standard. They arrived from MIT, Caltech, ETH Zurich, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, carrying between them 18 patents and enough peer-reviewed publications to fill a shelf. They ran every diagnostic available to modern battery science, scanning electron microscopy on the electrode cross-sections, X-ray diffraction analysis of the crystal structure, electrochemical impedance spectroscopy on every failing cell, AI-assisted defect mapping software capable of identifying deviations measured in nanometers. Every readout came back clean. The materials were correct. The chemistry was correct. The lamination sequence matched the written protocol precisely. And yet, the cells continued to collapse under load at a rate that would, if it persisted through the final production run, make the upcoming FAA certification demonstration a catastrophic public failure in front of people who had flown in specifically to see Aethon perform. The stakes around that demonstration were not abstract. Aethon's solid-state battery cells were the proposed power source for the first commercially viable electric passenger aircraft, a program backed by a major airline that had committed to a $4 billion partnership contingent on FAA certification. The demonstration was scheduled in 19 days. If the cells failed in front of the review panel and the airline's procurement committee, the contract would evaporate. Contracts already informally agreed upon elsewhere in the industry would follow, and the reputation Nadira had spent 12 years building, cell by cell, press by press, in a building that had once been a Baltimore garage, could be damaged in a single afternoon in ways that might take years to repair, if they could be repaired at all. Landon received a call from the board on the 6th evening. The investor, a man in his 60s who had written Aethon's first outside check and still kept a photo of the original garage on his office wall, asked the question without softening it. Was the failure rate really above 60% with 3 weeks to the demonstration? Landon said yes. He said the engineering team was working around the clock. The investor said that the airline's procurement committee had already booked their travel, and that failure was not a word he was prepared to hear attached to this company at this moment. And then he ended the call without a goodbye. Landon sat in his office for a long time after that, with the phone still in his hand. Through the glass partition, he could see the engineers in the testing bay. Several of them past 10 at night, the blue glow of their screens giving their faces a hollowed look he hadn't noticed in them before. For the first time since taking the position, He understood that his credentials had not prepared him for whatever was sitting in that testing bay, cold and silent, defying everything the finest instruments money could buy were capable of measuring. It was a quality technician named Calvin Dodd who found the thread that unraveled everything. Calvin had been with Aethon since the company's third year, back when the operation was housed in an industrial unit on the east side of the city, and the heat cut out every February. He was in his mid-50s, unhurried in the way of someone who had learned that most problems revealed themselves to patience faster than they revealed themselves to force. Frustrated by the dead ends produced by the new diagnostic approach, he spent 2 evenings in the records room, pulling the physical production logs from the archive shelves, the hand-filled binders from the years before the digital system was installed. What he found stopped him in the middle of the third binder. Across every successful production batch from Aethon's first 8 years, a notation appeared in the margin of each finalized process sheet, written in small, precise pencil rather than ink. NB, verified by hand. It appeared at the same point in every log, after the final press stage, before the seal cycle. It appeared on every batch that had achieved full certification. It did not appear on any of the 6 rejected batches from those years. Calvin pulled the archived security footage next. He spent most of a night finding the right clips. In frame after frame from the overhead camera above press number 3, the same figure appeared. Nadira Baines, in thin latex gloves and a faded sweatshirt, pressing the fingertips of both hands flat against the surface of a freshly stacked electrode assembly and holding still. 30 seconds, sometimes a full minute. Then she would adjust the hydraulic dial, never glancing at the readout, always by hand, nod once, and move to the next press. The batches from those sessions ran at 94% yield or better, without exception, for 8 straight years. In one clip, a young engineer appeared at the edge of the frame and asked her something. She answered briefly, without looking up. The engineer frowned, looked at the press, looked back at her, and walked away. The expression on his face was the specific expression of someone who has just been told something true that they are not yet equipped to believe. Calvin brought everything to Landon's desk the following morning. The binders, a tablet loaded with the footage, a printout showing the yield correlation across 12 years. Landon studied it all in silence, then asked the question that should have come months earlier. He wanted to know where Nadira Baines was now. Nobody in leadership had maintained contact after her departure. It took Calvin 3 phone calls to track her down. She was consulting for a small electric vehicle startup in Detroit, working out of a lab on the 2nd floor of a converted tire warehouse on the east side of the city, doing roughly the same work she had always done for a fraction of the recognition she had always deserved. Landon drove there himself, no assistant, no security detail. He parked on the street outside a building with a hand-painted address above the door and sat in his car for a moment, looking at it before he went in. He found her at a work table in the center of the 2nd floor lab, her attention entirely on the electrode assembly in front of her, her hands moving with the quiet, unhurried precision of someone who had performed this motion thousands of times and found in it something resembling peace. She did not look surprised when he appeared in the doorway. She did not look pleased either. She set down the assembly, pulled off her gloves, and waited for him to speak. Landon told her about the failure rate. He told her about the FAA demonstration and the $4 billion partnership and the 12 engineers who had spent 2 weeks running every test available to modern battery science and arrived at nothing. He told her the company needed her back. Nadira listened without interrupting. When he finished, she shook her head. The no came out quietly and without any edge of satisfaction. Not the no of someone savoring a reversal, but the no of someone who had thought carefully about what she owed and what she didn't, and had already arrived at a clear answer before he arrived at the door. Landon asked her why she had never pushed back the morning he let her go. He asked it as a genuine question, in the voice of someone who was finally ready to hear the answer rather than catalog it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about the patent. In Aethon's fourth year, she had developed a new electrode formulation, a specific approach to the binder chemistry that dramatically improved adhesion under the compression pressures she had been refining. She spent 8 months on it in the evenings after her regular shifts, writing up her methodology with care. When she brought it to her co-founder, a man who handled the legal and administrative side of the business, and told him she was ready to file, he said he would handle the paperwork. 3 weeks later, the filing was submitted with his name in the primary inventor field, and hers in a secondary acknowledgement that was, legally, nearly invisible. When she raised it with him, he told her the filing was already processed, that changing it would cost time and money they didn't have, that she knew her contribution was real even if the paperwork didn't fully reflect it. The formulation became one of the foundational patents underlying Aethon's manufacturing advantage. The co-founder left the company 18 months later, exercised his equity, and used the recognition attached to that patent to build a second career as a clean energy investment advisor. Nadira remained at Aethon. She kept working. She never filed a formal challenge, not because she had made peace with what happened, but because she had looked at the cost of the fight, the time, the legal expense, the attention pulled away from the actual work, and decided that the work itself mattered more to her than any document with her name on it. She told Landon this not as a complaint. She told it as information. Landon stood in the middle of that converted tire warehouse for a long time after she finished. He did not try to fill the silence with reassurance or explanation. He asked her, finally, what it would take for her to come back. She did not want a raise. She did not want a new title, or a public apology, or anything he could hand her in a single conversation. She wanted Aethon to fund a materials science apprenticeship program, real, multi-year, paid positions, at 3 HBCUs and 2 trade schools in the Baltimore area where she had grown up. She wanted it written into the company's operating charter, not announced in a press release, that could be quietly defunded in the next budget cycle. She wanted it formalized, on paper, with attorneys present, before she returned to the production floor. Landon said yes before she finished the sentence. He understood it was the easiest part of what she was asking, and that the harder part, proving the yes was real, would take considerably longer. The word spread through Aethon Energy Systems faster than any announcement could have carried it. By the time Nadira's car pulled into the employee lot on Tuesday morning, people were watching from the second-floor administrative windows. The production bay went quietly still when she pushed through the heavy doors and walked toward the presses. She did not address the room. She circled the press lines slowly, reading each station the way a person reads a familiar space after a long absence, noting what had shifted and what had remained. Then she stopped at press number 3, her press, pulled on a pair of thin latex gloves, and reached for the newest failed stack from the reject tray. She pressed her fingertip flat against the surface and held completely still. The production bay went so quiet that the ventilation system overhead became the loudest thing in the room. One of the engineers, the Caltech graduate who had joined the company 8 weeks earlier with 3 patents already to her name, felt a very strange sensation in the back of her mind, as though she were watching someone use a sense she had not been taught to develop. Nearly 2 full minutes passed before Nadira spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. She told them the stacking pressure was correct by the machine's measure. But the duration was off. The automated system released the press at the programmed timestamp, a timestamp that had been set based on the written protocol she had authored years earlier. And that protocol described, approximately, what she did. Not exactly. The real release point was not a fixed number of seconds. It was a state. The stack communicated it through the resistance under her fingers, a barely perceptible shift in the surface tension of the assembly, a change that the hydraulic sensor registered as noise and filtered out, but which meant the electrode layers had reached their optimal bonding moment and needed to be released immediately. Not a second later. Not half a second later. Then, she asked Calvin for the manual override handle. He had it in his hand before she finished asking. She loaded a new stack. She positioned her fingertips. She stood with her eyes closed while the press descended, and the room watched her and did not move. Then, at a moment invisible to everyone else, she released the handle. The stack came out. She set it in the certification tray and ran the load test. The cell held, clean discharge, full capacity, no delamination. She ran another, it held, then a third, then a fourth. The Caltech engineer put her hand over her mouth. Not because she was about to cry, but because she was trying very hard not to make a sound that would embarrass her. Landon Vale stood at the edge of the production floor and watched the display board change from red to green, one reading after another, and felt the particular weight of someone who has just seen something their education had genuinely not prepared them for. Not a humiliation, not a lesson, but something more permanent than either. He did not reach for his phone. He did not speak to anyone near him. He stood there and watched the woman he had dismissed as a redundancy stand calmly beside a running test rig that had just rendered 12 of the most credentialed engineers in the country very interested in studying the floor. The all-staff meeting the following morning was not the one Landon would have planned if he had been planning. He stood at the front of the conference room without notes and said what was actually true. He told them he had valued paper over presence. He had looked at Nadira Baines' file and made a judgment in under 5 minutes that 12 years of results had done nothing to complicate, because he had never looked at the results. He had never walked the floor. He had never asked a single question of the people who understood the actual work. He said, the company had come very close to paying for that blindness with everything Nadira had spent 12 years building from nothing, and that the loss would have been his fault specifically. Not a failure of the system, not a market condition, not a miscommunication. His fault. Several people in the room who had been with Aethon long enough to remember the South Baltimore garage listened to this with careful, measuring expertness. What they were measuring was whether the words would be followed by anything that lasted longer than the meeting. The apprenticeship program charter was signed and filed with the company's attorneys that same week. The first cohort, 4 students from Morgan State, 2 from Coppin State, 2 from a trade school in West Baltimore, began at Aethon the following quarter. Nadira supervised the program alongside her new title, Director of Foundational Research, created for her by unanimous vote of the engineering staff before Landon had thought to propose it himself. She kept wearing her sweatshirts to work. She kept her hands in the process, working alongside the engineers who had been brought in to replace her, sharing what she knew without ceremony or resentment. The Caltech engineer, who had covered her mouth in the testing bay, became one of her most dedicated students, staying late twice a week to practice the press calibration by feel until she could hold still long enough to actually hear what the stack was telling her. After 3 months, she was hitting the correct release moment with an 82% success rate. Nadira told her this was remarkable and said it the way she said everything, without embellishment, without qualification, which made it land harder than praise from anyone else in the building. The FAA demonstration took place on a Tuesday in early spring. The cells performed without a single failure through 64 sequential load trials. The airline's procurement committee, seated along one wall of the testing bay in pressed business clothes that looked as incongruous in that room as Landon's blazer, had once looked on the production floor, signed the preliminary certification paperwork that afternoon. Nadira stood at the perimeter during the demonstration, her arms folded, watching the engineering team, the same 12 who had spent 2 weeks failing, present the results to the panel and answer questions and accept the handshakes afterward. She did not move toward the center of the room. She did not make herself visible to the procurement committee. She watched with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lives just underneath one. And when the last handshake was done and the visitors began gathering their materials, She turned and walked back toward the production floor, without waiting for anyone to notice she was leaving. She had not come back for the recognition. The cells had been failing because no one had been taught to feel what she knew how to feel, and that gap was a problem she was in a position to close. That was the reason she had returned. The reason the gap had existed in the first place was a different conversation, one she had decided years ago she would not spend her life inside. Later that same evening, long after the testing bay had emptied and the building had gone to its after-hours quiet, Landon found her alone beside press number 3, running a final calibration check on a batch that didn't strictly need one. He asked her, haltingly, the way a person asks something they've been rehearsing without meaning to, what she was actually listening for when she pressed her hands against the metal. What was the thing that the sensors couldn't find? She considered the question. She set down the assembly she was holding and looked at the press for a moment before answering. She told him the sensors measured what the engineers told them to measure. They were very good at measuring those things. But a material under compression was not simply a set of measurable properties. It was a process unfolding in time, and the moment that mattered was not a value you could assign in advance. It was a response. The stack told you when it was ready, the same way a person told you when they needed something. You just had to stop moving long enough to feel it. Diagnostics could tell you what was wrong, she said. Only patience could tell you what was needed. Landon carried that sentence with him in the years that followed, turning it over during boardroom presentations and budget reviews, and the small daily moments when he felt the pull of a spreadsheet, making something simpler than it actually was. He kept a note-card in his desk drawer, with one line on it in her handwriting. The sentence she had said as an afterthought, almost on her way out the door that evening, as a reminder that the most important information in any system was rarely the information that fit cleanest into a report. That fall, Aethon purchased the Baltimore row house where Nadira had grown up. The landlord sold without much negotiation. The current residents were offered leases that would not increase for 10 years. The ground floor became a youth science and technology center, with a small workshop in the back where a donated hydraulic press sat beside a shelf of textbooks and a sign above the door that read, in plain black letters, "Every machine has something to tell you. Learn to listen." It opened on a Saturday in October. Nadira was there for the ribbon cutting, but left before the speeches ended, because there was a calibration run waiting back at the plant, and she had never been the kind of person who could sit still for very long when something needed her attention. She drove back through the city in the early afternoon, windows down, the cool October air carrying the particular smell of Baltimore's East Side, something between river water and October leaves and the particular urban exhaust of a city that had been working hard for a very long time, and she felt somewhere behind her ribs the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent 12 years building something real and had finally been given the room to finish explaining what it was.